Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Weep Union, and in this one we have several Russian advances, one of which is a second crossing in the Oskil river line, where the Russians are expanding their control over the western bank of it. At the same time, the Russians are developing offensive operations near Kupyansk in the northern and southern flanks of it, and near Velyka Novosilka from the southern direction. Starting out in the northern section of the front line, we see that the Russians have crossed the Oskil river line near Vremivka. We see that this section of it, there is not a wide part of the river line. This means both armored vehicles and infantry can easily cross over. This has allowed the Russians to cross over and gain control over this first patch south of the settlement of Dvorichna, as well as close to the highway connecting Dvorichna with Kupyansk. The Russians are also near Zapatne. The Russians will look to expand towards the surrounding forest patches, potentially going into Dvorichna, flanking it from the northern and southern direction with the potential crossing directly head on. The Russians would here look to gain control over Dvorichna, which will create a solid crossing across the Oskil river line and allow the Russians to develop offensive operations in this direction. However, the Ukrainians do have a lot of forces in this section of the front line, which will allow them to quickly relocate forces to that direction and deal with this incursion. The Russians are likely doing this not to gain control over these areas and gain a foothold and develop an offensive operation, but instead to relocate Ukrainian forces. Depending on how many forces the Ukrainians have available in this section of the front line, the results can vary significantly. If the Ukrainians are very low on their forces near Kupyansk, they would be unable to relocate enough forces, or relocating forces would weaken the Kupyansk section of the front line, allowing the Russians to enter the city again and develop offensive operations within it. And this will weaken both sides of the front, both near Dvorichna and near Kupyansk. However, if the Ukrainians do have enough forces in the section of the front line, they would be able to deal with the crossing, push the Russians back across the Oskil river line, and then secure both sections of the front line, relocating their forces back to Kupyansk and potentially launching a counterattack or trying to reopen the crossing between Borova and Kupyansk here in the eastern bank of the Oskil river line. The Russians are continuously pressuring Kupyansk. However, this section of the front line is very difficult for the Russians. They are unable to make significant gains. Therefore, this could potentially be one of the areas in which the Ukrainians may be planning their counteroffensive, which they claim to be preparing. However, the Russians do have defensive lines prepared, several layers of them. This section of the front line is the one where the Ukrainians have had the most success in counterattacks. There's also the possibility of it being near Lipsy to push the Russians out of the Kharkiv region, both in the direction of Lipsy and Vovchansk. Since these areas we've seen a lot of active positional fighting by the Ukrainians here near Hlyboki on the eastern flank, where geolocated footage has shown the Ukrainians slowly advancing alongside it. We've also seen some movements here in the western parts of Hlyboki, attempting to land a pincer maneuver on the settlement to hit the supply lines of the Russians towards it. Losing Hlyboki will allow the Ukrainians to push the Russians back across the border area, and this is why this is one of the priorities for the Ukrainians, as it will allow them to free up a lot of forces to other sections of the front line, for example, Kupyansk. So we see that there's a potential for several offensive operations in that direction. Could also be that they would focus their forces in the Kursk direction and double down on it with additional forces, potentially other sections of the front line. We never know. It's only speculation until it happens. In the Pokrovsk section of the front line, the Russians have advanced further towards Novopustinka, where they've managed to capture an additional forest line and some fields, gaining very close to the settlement and the southern flank of the Ukrainian first line of defense near Pokrovsk, where the Russians are here attempting to gain a foothold within it, similar to how they have one near Lysivka and Suchy Yar, where they'll look to gain full control of it by attacking both flanks before moving up along the highway directly from Selidove. Moving further south, we see here near Bereski, the Russians have advanced north of the fortified positions, looking to close the pocket, gain full control over the railways, before pushing towards Stary This will allow the Russians to connect their forces in the northern and southern directions to improve the supply of the forces in the area, since now the Russians are relying on the Vremivka supply line, which moves through Ukrainsk and down towards Pereski from that direction. However, if they can gain control over the entire railway, they can use Selidove and move down south from that. There's also the Selidove direction towards Sonsivka. At the same time, they can also move through Maximilianivka up through the Vovcha river line and then onwards to Ilinka and Pereski. There are a lot of supply lines that they can use to reach Stary from, and the Russians continue their build-up in the northern flank of Kurakhove in their attempts to flank the settlement itself. Within this settlement, the Russians have advanced along the fortified positions just south of it, where they are slowly inching towards the apartment complex areas in the southern outskirts of the settlement, where they are looking to connect Dalnie in the south with Kurakhove in the north, to gain control over the apartment complex areas and the industrial zone within the city, gaining full control of it, which will allow the Russians to develop offensive operations from Kurakhove itself, direction of Dashne, encircling the river line here to the south, moving along the fortified positions, and then developing offensive operations towards the Dnipropetrovsk region and then upwards towards Pokrovsk once they capture the southern parts of the Donetsk region. It is likely that the objective of the Russians is to gain control over the southern part of the Donetsk region here in the month of December, the catalyst of which would be the capture of Velyka Novosilka and Kurakhove, following which there is insignificant Ukrainian defensive positions, in the sense that the Russians can flank the fortified positions of the Ukrainians near Dvorichna, Oleksivka, and so on from the northern direction, which will bypass the fortified positions. And here from the eastern direction, they will be able to move along the fortified positions, flanking the fortified positions on the high ground. So yet again, the Russians can bypass the fortified positions and flank them from the rear, which would make these defenses insignificant. Near Velyka Novosilka itself, the Russians have made significant advances, capturing 20 square kilometers here to the south of Vremivka. The objective is to gain control over these fortified positions south of the settlements, gain control over the river line in between Vremivka, Velyka Novosilka, and Blagodatne here in the eastern bank of the Vremivsky Ledge. And this would lead to the Russians gaining significant advantages here south of the settlement. The Ukrainians still have control over the high ground with fortified positions, which would weaken the benefits that the Russians gain by gaining control over the southern parts. And the Russian positions within Velyka Novosilka are still extremely weak due to the Ukrainian fortified positions northwest of Velyka Novosilka. The Russian offensive operations are clearly focused around the southern parts of the Donetsk region, with the defensive line near Pokrovsk being the top of the area of operations of the Russians, while the border to the Zaporizhia region is the western outskirts of the area of operations. The Russians will look to gain control over Velyka Novosilka, which will lead to significant gains by the Russians on both flanks of the settlement, as the Ukrainians would have lost their main supply hub for their forces in the area. Cutting off the supply lines in the northern direction from Pokrovsk towards Velyka Novosilka would also have a significant impact on the Ukrainian forces in the southern parts of the Donetsk region once the Russians capture Kurakhove. This will lead to either a Ukrainian withdrawal from the southern parts of the Donetsk region, either towards Pokrovsk in the east, the Zaporizhia region in the west, or towards the Dnieper region in the north, which will lead to the Russian capture of the southern parts of the Donetsk region and the beginning of the Battle of Pokrovsk, which will likely last a couple of months as the Ukrainians have prepared significant defenses. It'll be similar to the Battle of Avdiivka, where the Russians storm the fortified positions. They'll then heavily bombard the city with FAB bombs, which will lead to the most well-fortified positions of the Ukrainians being destroyed. This will then lead to the Russians gaining significant ground, and the Ukrainians being forced to withdraw from the settlement, which will then allow the Russians to develop offensive operations further. And similar to the Avdiivka collapse, the Russians will be able to make significant gains following that, which will lead into a spring offensive by the Russians, and the battle over the entirety of the Donetsk region will commence, and it will likely be decided in 2025. And that'll be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.